Hello, and welcome to another episode of Disrupt Your Now. Tonight, we have an amazing guest, Anshar Seraphim, who is an expert in behavioral psychology, different personality types, all kinds of stuff. So, Anshar, I want you to introduce yourself and tell us about your background and how you got to where you are today.
I kind of interestingly, I have autism, so I was about 75% nonverbal at age 11, and
Mhm.
what that looked like was just I would only really talk to people that I knew super well. I don't know if you ever had that experience of like being a kid and they're real like shy and hide behind their mother's skirt or whatever,
Yeah.
and it's only people who actually know them that they're familiar with that they'll talk to. Except that stage never really ended for me. And as I got older, when I was around like family members and stuff like that, I could be pretty loquacious. But um, when I was around people, there was just so much social fear,
Yeah.
and I was very disconnected. I remember when I was, a teenager, I would walk around and I would just have my arms crossed and I'd be looking at the ground and I would just kind of walk around like that.
Mm.
And I just thought that I was different. I came from that generation before we were, passing out diagnosis like crazy. So, they didn't even come up with a diagnosis for Asperger's and have it added to the DSM until like 2 years before I graduated high school. And
Mhm.
since then, we've integrated Asperger's into the autism spectrum, and there's actually quite a few people in the modern autism community that kind of take affront to using the name Asperger's, even though there's a little bit of a difference. People talk about high functioning or low functioning or whatever,
Mhm.
and whether they're discussing communication ability or they're talking about intellectual impairments and stuff like that. And the thing that was kind of typified differently by Hans Asperger was that he called them little professors, basically. And they would pick an area, a couple areas of special interest and kind of deep dive into it. And they had good facility with language, above average, and they didn't usually have intellectual impairments. And so he was kind of typifying a little slice of high functioning autism. And
Mhm.
since then, we've kind of moved away from using his name just because he was, associated with Germany in the 40s and all of that stuff, and we try to get away from that stuff. But there's a lot of generational differences in the disability community, and my experience of being diagnosed at 19 years old when I went into the military, that was a very different experience than people today have. And I think the median age of diagnosis now is 4 years old. So
Yeah.
imagine how different that journey was. So for me, I didn't really have a real friend that I could talk to aside from just like sharing a common interest and going and doing that thing with them until I was about 25. It was
Mm.
really, really hard for me. I didn't even get my driver's license until I was 37 because of my son
Wow.
issues. So I had a lot of challenges, but where it kind of started was recognizing the gap and having that hunger for wanting to be able to connect to people and not knowing what was wrong.
Mm.
And because I was, past the age of reason when I got my diagnosis, I think I processed it a little bit differently. And over those 6 years of just being so lonely and stuff after that diagnosis of wanting to connect to people as an adult, um, I decided, I made the decision to change the way that I was interacting with people, to start working on my social interactions. At 19, I was barely able to control the tone of my voice. It would go all over the place.
Wow.
I couldn't give people eye contact. There was very little social reciprocity. When I had a conversation with someone, it was kind of just like info dumping, and then I would move on. Um, and there's also a few common features of autism that can be really frustrating just because, and I won't go too far into this because I'm trying to just introduce myself, but um, one of the problems is that your symptoms when you're neurodivergent, a lot of the communication is nonverbal, and we have a tendency to take the behavior of other people as a form of communication. And then there's also certain idiosyncrasies that go along with a diagnosis like autism. So if you are social, you have a tendency to change the subject to something that you know a lot about so that you can kind of feel more socially confident. Um, there's an inability to recognize the normal way that you would normally socially reciprocate. So someone might relate something to you, and then in response, because you want to connect to that person, you'll talk about a similar experience that you have, but you miss the step of validating the fact that they just shared in their emotions. And so it
Mm.
can kind of come across as talking about yourself a lot.
Yeah.
So the thing that frustrated me was that most of the symptoms of ASD because people didn't know about them, it made me come across as a jerk to people. I had an early special interest in language, and I really sabotaged myself with that, because when you speak at any level that's above someone else, if their education level or their interest level, it tends to come across as very condescending. So all the way up through my first 25 years of my life, when I did interact with people, they had the assumption that I was being a jerk, or that I was selfish, or that I would only talk about myself. And I think part of that is something called masking that we do. When you have autism, you try to fit in with neurotypical people, and that can have its benefits. It's kind of like a pith helmet anthropologist going and spending time with a group of tribes people. You kind of learn their customs and stuff like that. But the flip side of it is that if you don't share your challenges with people when you start interacting with them, it can sabotage you later, because even if you're perfect at masking, eventually you're going to make a mistake, and you don't give the other person enough context to be able to take that mistake in the right light. I give this example a lot when I'm speaking, but Tourette's. Now, mind you, there's only like a 2.5% incidence in Tourette's with people actually swearing and doing things that are inappropriate. A lot of it is just some involuntary, twitches or tremors, but let's say, for the sake of argument, you're sitting down and having a conversation with someone who has Tourette's, and you go 2.5 minutes just with a normal conversation, and they haven't shared that challenge with you. Well, if all of a sudden out of nowhere they start swearing, or say something super socially inappropriate because they have an impulse that they can't suppress, you're gonna have a very negative reaction to that.
Yeah.
Until that moment, you didn't know that anything was going on with them. So I had to kind of balance that idea of being able to share with other people what my challenges are, but at the same time step outside of my own wheelhouse. And that process was really arduous. And in the process of doing that and having to systemize that, and essentially turning psychology and cognitive neuroscience and applied behavioral psychology and psychosocial dynamics and all that, turning that into a special interest, an autistic special interest, I was able to start putting the things in place to be able to change those things about myself. And then my final kind of phase of development was I decided to work in jewelry. And jewelry, if you don't know, I mean, that's a completely emotionally driven. Your value of everything that you're selling is emotional and sociological. Your customer relationships it's all about sharing and listening. And I think that was really the best thing for me, because here I am working 50 hours a week, as a manager, assistant manager, a full-time salesperson, and having to connect to the emotions of other people. And that put me into that challenging situation where you have to grow. If you want to learn a new language, you got to go into a place where you have to use it.
Yeah, immerse yourself.
And that immersion and that necessity creates a different system for you. So it's all about mindset there. But by the time that I was done after 7 years with them, I was actually teaching, applied behavioral psychology and emotional dynamics to salespeople in the Pacific Northwest.
Wow.
Sales associates and managers, all who are off running their own stores and stuff now. And I got so much confidence from doing that, because I really started to understand how all those systems come together. And I think that some of us have the experience of trying to go to college or pursue an advanced degree at a young age versus doing it at an older age. And your appreciation, your barefoot reverence for in that learning process changes, because you're there to actually learn and not just get a mark or something like that. And so I think that it changes your investment in that process, and that's what I would liken it to for me, having to do that. And one of the challenges, I think, was dishonesty. Because masking is an inherently dishonest form of communication. You're misrepresenting yourself. And so I had to kind of, again, balance that. And I'm proud to say that I completely got lying out of my life, because it had to be binary choice for me. It was like being an alcoholic. Too easy to solve problems that way. And so for the last 17 years, I've been completely honest with people, and it throws people off. But I found that it's added a whole lot to my life.
That's really a great point. And, when I first met you the other year, and you mentioned you were a high stakes negotiator, and I have a cousin or several cousins who have Asperger's, and I'm like, I can see high stakes negotiation being a great field for somebody with Asperger's to be in, because y'all are able to cut out the emotions that a lot of other people, I don't know if I'm saying it right.
Well, if your cup is empty, right? If your cup is empty because you don't even do something badly, you can't do it at all, then one perk of doing that is that you don't have any bad habits to correct. You have everything to build from scratch. And I spend a lot of time, lecturing on personality dynamics and that sort of thing. One of the reasons I talk about that is that figuring your own default mode of communication is super helpful. But then also being able to understand that in the original like Jungian archetypes, he talked about conscious and unconscious personality. And what that means is that you have a natural predilection for a particular style of communication, a particular way of envisioning thoughts, a particular way of self-expression. But when you put yourself into a situation repeatedly where you need to move that dynamic, then you can construct an emissary of your personality to be able to interact with that group of people. And a lot of us do that process unconsciously. If you're an introvert and you have to do a lot of public speaking, you'll develop different alters, different mental modes of being able to do that. And often that process is something that we don't do through intention, rather, through trial and error. And even if you have natural skills, even if you're a skilled natural storyteller, let's say, or maybe you're an INFJ, so you're very, emotionally intuitive, you're like a Sherlock Holmes with emotions or whatever. Having natural skills can be a liability, because if you don't understand the synthesis of that skill, where it comes from, it takes away the ability to do it reductively, to take certain parts away from that approach that might invalidate someone. But it also, if you have a default approach, I think one of the things that you learn when you move from like average sales, and entry level sales, is you have this spiel, and you have this thing that you kind of go back to the same toolbox phrases over and over again. When you get onto a more advanced level, you start to realize that the same behavior that closes one client will walk another. And that means that having a rote script that you go into is the worst thing that you can do.
Yeah.
But it is a necessary stepping stone into learning. First you have to know what to say, but then you have to learn how to say it. And that's why communication becomes such a big focus.
Yeah. Well, I love that you took everything about yourself and created your own career because of your interests and your personality and everything. Instead, 'cause one of the things that I love to do is work with clients who already are successful, but they feel unfulfilled. And I find so many entrepreneurs who are successful, but who are unhappy, or people who've gone through life checking off the boxes. Okay, I need to do this. Let's go do this. And they've built their business doing what everybody else wants, instead of figuring out what they really enjoy, what they're really good at, what is really fulfilling to them. And so to me, it's so inspiring that you have created this whole career around not only what your interests are, but what your problems were and the things that you needed to overcome. And by working on those, created this career out of it.
I was in information technology for a decade and a half. So I
Wow.
thought that was what I was going to be doing for the rest of my life, was just working with computers, because computers to me made sense.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you mentioned that. I just had that conversation with Marlena actually not that long ago. I asked her the question, well, what would be the version of what you do that would just make you ridiculously happy, that you would be excited every single day? What are the parts of it that you don't like? What are the parts of it that you do like? Let's see if there's a need or a business model or an approach that lets you get to do more of what you love most doing as an entrepreneur, or as a visionary, or and I think it's an important question, because it's not just about your happiness, it also affects your buy-in. You have so many dopamine-led behaviors and cognitive belief systems and all kinds of things that are going to affect what you do. So not being on board and really, drinking your own Kool-Aid, so to speak, not being 100% into what you're doing, it affects your approach. And you'll find yourself subconsciously doing things like trying to preload people's objections, put stuff on your website that answers, certain questions, because you don't want to have to deal with those same questions over and over again.
Yeah.
But sometimes that effort is directed at not doing a part of the process that we find tiresome or exhausting, not necessarily thinking about what that narrative is like for the client, and whether or not having that particular question answered in person is going to give more gravity to your presentation. But also, and this is another one, is answering that question out in the open going to turn away some of your potential clients? And are you only doing that for your benefit, or are you doing it for them? And so one of the things that I talk to entrepreneurs and solopreneurs and even C-suite sometimes about is that sometimes you need to create a separate funnel for different kinds of clients, because those different disparate avatars sometimes need to have a completely different method of social proof or ideological realignment or whatever, depending on what it is that you do. You know, some of us are lucky enough to work in an industry where the product or service kind of sells itself and the world at large knows why they want it. But in a world full of innovation, sometimes the biggest problem is being able to sell something and people don't know that they want it or don't know that they need it. And then you have to be able to impart that. And then the last problem, which is that when we start to look at the business world through our own lens, we have a tendency to just like, I don't know if have you ever studied the 5 love languages before?
Yeah.
So
little, I don't know that much, but I've read about it. Yeah.
The takeaway from that, right, is that the way that we process and value different things socially, emotionally, is not always the same way that everyone else does. And if we get into this mentality of selling ourselves, you know, which I think is a crucial mistake, you know, go into business for yourself, find something that makes you happy, solve problems that make you happy. But everything else is about the client.
Right.
And it's easy to forget that sometimes the people who need our good or service or need to hear our presentation the most are the people who are least like us, because people who are more like us are able to piece together why they need something or why it makes sense. And if we get into our little, you know, cliques of people that are like us, because we tend to surround ourselves with people that make us comfortable being who we are, then we're really in an echo chamber for being able to understand the way that we come across to other people. And it's a little staggering when you think about it, but one of the things you learn when you learn about psychology is IQ, right? Your average IQ is between 95 and 105 here in the States, depending on, you know, which disparate region and all of that. And have you ever considered the 15% that are on both sides of that bell curve? Because if you go to the far left of that bell curve, you have a little bit less than 1 in 7 people that have underneath of an 85 IQ. Is your presentation, is your product, is your service coming across to those people? Are those the people who might need your good or service the most? You know, I think a lot of us forget that that's a part of society, unless we're on the road, and sometimes we notice. But and then the flip side, you know, if someone's operating at a higher level, are they going to be bored with this information? You know, and where on that bell curve does your primary avatar dwell? And how are you going to be able to talk to those people? So I think there's a lot of steps of synthesis that people miss because we're taught from a very young age that whole golden rule thing of treat everyone like they're us. And that might be a good ethos for, you know, treating a stranger well, but it's a terrible model to go off of for business or for interpersonal interaction, because really you have to focus on the platinum rule, which is how do I treat this person the way that they need to be treated, that they want to be treated, so that self-perception and that social modality gets satisfied so that they can focus on everything else that we have to say. And I think people miss that.
I love that, the platinum rule. So say it again for people that didn't quite catch it.
The golden rule is treat other people the way that you want to be treated. But the platinum rule means acknowledging that other people have their own needs, have their own way that they want to be treated, and that you can spend enough time talking to and listening to them. You can treat them well by letting them tell you the way that they need to be treated. And if you do that and get that out of the way first, then it's going to be a lot easier for them to hear the rest of your message.
Yeah, because the key is in business, everything should be about the client. How can you help them? How can you serve them? Not how can they, you know, how can you make money off of them?
It's not even just ego. I mean, if you're attached to your own perspective, then, you know, there is that tendency to only want to serve clients that are like you.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, depending on the industry you're in, that can work. But if you need to connect people, like let's say you're a very emotional storytelling person, you know, I had you do your personality assessment just before, just so we had some stuff to talk about. You know, you relate really well to feelings and you're really good with storytelling. You know, what happens when that INTJ sits down in front of you and they're looking for a bunch of, you know, concrete stuff, and
Yeah.
you're trying to tell a story and hit their feelings. And they're like, why are we talking about feelings here? I'm trying to find out what's going on with this product and whether or not it's efficacious, and tell me what rubric I'm supposed to use for that and what instances it won't work. And you're having very different conversations. And this is where understanding the people that you serve is so important.
Great point. And I want to say Marlene is on here, and she says, for people who are listening and not watching, I've seen Anshar in action. All you have to do is give him the goal to hit, and he'll systematically build a ladder to not only reach it, but exceed it. It's amazing.
Well, if a ladder only goes to the point that you're trying to reach, then you're still going to have trouble getting off the top of that ladder. If a ladder exceeds where you're trying to reach, all you have to do is step off the ladder and you're there. Scale is important.
That's a great point. Interesting to think about. Let's talk about more about our own personality. Oh, hey, Jason. Jason goes, yeah, he will. Hey, Jason.
I had so much fun on Jason's interview.
I know he's
check that out.
I love him and Marlena. And whenever I hear Jason's name or say his name, I think of Jason Bourne or whatever, like action movies.
I've had a couple of interviews, and I think normally people have this kind of like snapshot interview style where it's like 30 or 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And for me, because I have so much to say, I've done so much reading and research, plus the autism that doesn't help. I can talk for a very, very long time on a particular topic. And what I loved about being on his show was he actually gave me the latitude to do that. He just broke it apart into 3 episodes. And that was so much fun. I'd never actually had that opportunity for someone to really like dive in deep. And so I could actually show the connection between the different ideas. So that was something that he did really well that I want to.
And I loved it too, because I got to listen to the episodes and I learned so much. And y'all's conversation is just really great. So anybody out there, if you're interested in listening to it, look up Jason Croft. Jason, put in the comments your website address.
The other way that's easy is you can just put my name in quotations on YouTube, and all of those are up too.
Okay. So yeah, just today I listened to 2 of the episodes, and I'd already listened to, I think it's the 3rd one. So it's very, very interesting. Oh, 4 hours, man.
Well, I mean, we talked about the evolutionary biology of the brain and where our different psychological and sociological idioms and stuff come from. We talked about how that negative narrative of emotional negative primacy can affect your personal belief systems. Talk about imposter syndrome. Talked about where cognitive beliefs come from, the process that you need to reframe them, how to put a new behavior into place, how to learn or transmit a new skill so that you can delegate effectively. I mean, we covered so much.
Yeah.
But it's cool because you get to see the interconnectedness of ideas. And sometimes when you get those little snapshots, that can be difficult.
Yeah, it is great. It's like taking a mini course in college, except big overview down to the details. I really enjoy it.
Well, you would think, right? You would think. And I had someone actually give me a comment after that interview, and they're like, well, what do you have left after that, after you talked about all of those ideas? I have 400 hours just of negotiation training.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. Because when I said to the details, it's like, not the details down here granular, but the details within kind of the big topics that y'all were talking about. It is great. I highly recommend those episodes, y'all. So let's talk about entrepreneurs who are in business, and like you touched on their personality and other personalities, like their clients' personalities. Do you have suggestions, recommendations, whatever, for people like that may not even understand their own personality, much less their perfect client?
Your first objective is always to understand yourself. And it's not, I think people can get kind of, I know that like Steve, when I was talking with Steve Sims, he had a little bit of apprehension in taking, personality tests and stuff, because he doesn't want to be put into a little box.
Yeah.
But the personality assessment isn't really about putting you into a little box. It's about understanding your strengths, understanding the way that different aspects of the way that you deal with problems or that you address issues, how those things function. And then it also gives you a rubric for figuring out whether or not your default personality type is the best personality type to use in communicating with your core demographic, your core audience. And I've given this example before. I was working with someone else, and we worked with an energy company, and they were doing like selling like recycled or collected things from sustainable sources, that sort of thing. And as a bunch of engineers, a bunch of NT types, if you get into the Myers-Briggs, they put themselves into a little covey of engineers and only bounced ideas back and forth with that. They believed wholeheartedly that all they needed to do was properly position the data, the statistics on their website, and that would alone drive everyone to action. And this is the problem with thinking inside of your own perspective. Because if you looked at their website, it was literally just a bunch of abstract colors with a whole bunch of numbers and statistics. And they kept it that way for like 4 years.
Jeez.
And only right now did they make some minor changes, just because they went back and checked in on them. And a lot of the human faces that they used still weren't looking, and were using micro expressions or anything. So I was kind of baffled. And it was funny to me because in that market, in that European market that they were in, there was actually a lot of scams and stuff going on. So being able to build trust and a positive narrative and show social proof, and there were a lot of checkboxes there that needed to be ticked they couldn't do with just doing that information. But because they've been in that echo chamber, they were dismissive of those ideas. So it's important to, one, always do market research. And market research isn't showing it to all your buddies that are like you. Market research is finding the people that are least like you that would still need your product and getting their input. Another is that self-assessment, understanding your own personality. And I think people get a little washed up in the whole details of personality science. And I think the thing that you have to remember first and foremost is that you only really need to know about one aspect of personality science to start. And that is how that particular personality responds to your good, your service, your product, your personage, whatever it is that you're putting forth onto the market. And it's the same with any business. It's the same with any position that you're in. You're going to drop something as input into that system. And when you do, you're going to get a set number of results. And there's not that many reactions. Did I lose you? I saw your video freeze.
No, I didn't realize that it did. So
Okay.
I have had, over the past month or so, I've had a lot of problems with my internet, though.
Talk to me later about that, IT professional. So basically the idea is that if you drop something into that system, it's kind of like a pachinko machine. There's variability, but you only have a few separate outcomes that can come out. And that makes that particular source of stimulus and reaction fairly predictable. And so it's not that difficult to systemize how different personality types, how different emotional narratives, how all of that stuff comes together, because it's going to create concrete differences in the way that people react to an offering. And understanding those individualized reactions and then what to do about those reactions, that's the first part of personality science that's going to matter to you. And then the next is when you're going to be doing in-person interactions and understanding the different types of difficulties that you can have communication-wise with other people who have different narratives, different personality types. There are people that get nervous about a purchase, and you need to change the topic to something that they know a lot about so that they can raise their confidence level before they're at a point where they're ready to make a decision. There are different variegated emotional triggers. I don't know if anyone thinks about this, but your decision-making process starts with emotional impulse, and then only after is that processed, Brodmann's area 942, the prefrontal cortex. Only then are you going to weigh, is this the right decision for me? Is this going to have consequences? Will I have long-term benefits from this? And to answer Marlene's question, there are certain words or phrases, and I think the first thing is communication. You want to focus on pace and focus. Pace is how quickly does that person communicate versus are they more deliberate? And this isn't a throwback to intelligence. It's about how smart they are.
Yeah.
This culturally, we learn and we communicate, and our personality expresses itself, and we either have a slower approach or we have a faster approach. And then the next is in the concrete. Do we talk about fact-based things in our communication, or do we talk about feelings? If If you ask someone who's like an INTJ, I'm an INTJ, and plus I'm all the way over on the spectrum, but plus I have autism. So I mean, that's why it's very polarized with me. If you ask me about my last vacation, I will give you a list of all the things that I did, why I did them, what was my takeaway, and then I'll be like, what more do you want to know? Whereas if I ask someone like an INFP, like you, I'm like, oh, it was great. I got to do this, do that. It's totally changed my perspective on this. And you wouldn't believe the feeling that I got into the Sistine Chapel, and my whole life changed after I got to swim with that sea turtle. And that process of communicating is very, very different. So you'll be able to quickly identify that, because remember, there's only 4 different kind of spectra in the Myers-Briggs system, and that's just one of the many personality systems out there. But I like going with that as a base, because a lot of people have had exposure to it. You're either introverted or extroverted. We can figure that out, right? You're intuitive or sensing. So are we making mental models, or are we very into what's going on in our sensory environment? Are we feeling or thinking? I think we can probably figure that out, right? And then the last is JP. So are we judging or perceiving?
I think that's the one that has always confused me the most.
Here's your cheat code for it.
Okay.
If a person compares things, they're judging. If they isolate one thing in order to understand that unique perspective, they're P-type. And that's why P-types are often better at storytelling.
Oh, okay.
Different elements that go into the unique perspective of that thing. So once you start to because remember, all of this is abstract until you try to put it into action, because you're not going to get to be able to synthesize these ideas in a way that you can use until you put it into action. So you have to decide what would be the way that would be most impactful for you to experiment with personality types. And sometimes you don't have to look any further away from home. Learning your romantic partner, or the people that are in your immediate workplace, or your assistant or whatever, learning their personality type, learning yours, and then just find out what the common communication disconnects or different types of focus are between those 2 personality types, and see how that affects your relationship. And if you do that, you give yourself the benefit of having an impactful nearby situation. It's actually going to affect your life. And you'll get to see the power of personality dynamics. And then you can worry about applying it to your business or whatever, because you'll have the buy-in. You'll be like, oh man, this is totally different. Now I need to point this in my direction of making money, because they know it works. So find something close to home first.
Yeah, I was thinking, and when I was listening to you and Jason, I was thinking, I really need to get my husband to do it. I know he's an I, but it's like when I talk to him, sometimes you can see his eyes rolling back in his head. They're like glazing over, because I'm like, bah, bah, bah. But the funny thing, Anshar, is I talked very little when I was younger. I was really shy and quiet. And my mother used to say I didn't start talking until my sister went to college. Now, in all fairness, that's because she was talking all the time, and I couldn't. But people that know me now are like, oh my God, how could you have ever been shy? But I still am in different scenarios. Like, I have no problem getting up and speaking in front of hundreds of people, and I have no problem speaking in small groups. But when it's kind of like 20, 30 people, and you have those people that are like making it all about them, or they're the expert, that's when I pull back. Even if I know more than them, I pull back, and I'm just like.
And this is something that we relate to, because we're both N types, right? Is when people raise their hand and try and answer a question with a personal story, that's a big derailment for us. And this is where being able to anticipate different types and stuff is really important. One of the things that you'll find interesting is when we go off and we do public speaking or whatever, we often, like I said, construct a disparate personality type for that. And it's almost like we kind of emulate what we think is, or try to synthesize or put ourselves into a different perspective. But when you watch it, and if you ever watch yourself, if you videotape yourself or something like that, explaining something to someone, and you can just do this at home. It doesn't have to be like a big thing in front of a whole bunch of people at first, right? Just get comfortable with it first.
Yeah.
But you'll notice that when you talk about certain topics, your gesticulations will change, your tonality will change, your facial expressions will change, because you've created an alter to go with that subject. It's the same thing when you're a salesperson. Sometimes you clock in for the day and you'll put on a different personality type to coexist in that environment. You can either do that through intention, or you can do it passively without realizing it. You do it passively without realizing it, well, then you can't make any changes to it. You can't recognize when it's not working. So, and you'll see, like I worked with a C-suite once. She was doing a corporate sustainability, and her vocation was an engineer. And when she was talking about engineering topics and stuff, her glasses were down, and she was, and then you talk about something that involved the corporation, glasses would come up, completely different, expressions, and she was much more animated, and you could tell that she had to go into that mental place to talk about that thing. I think when people think about personality, if they see that number on the line go in the middle, they start to think to themselves, oh, I'm both of those things. And the real truth is that, let's say you're an ambivert, right? Let's say you're both introverted and extroverted. There will be certain things in your life that you're extroverted about, and there will be certain things in your life that you're introverted about. We're creatures of habit. So it's not that you're just wandering around back and forth. You need to read both of those types and see which one of them applies more for you in a particular situation, because you will find a methodology of being able to connect to people, transmit ideas, and get buy-in when it comes to that particular topic. And again, if you don't do it through intention, then it's going to become automatic, and you're going to do something without realizing it. And that means you can't pull away from the approach or change it if it's not working.
So what do you suggest? So, okay, so we get people that are close to us to take the test and, kind of work on communicating better with them or whatever. And then what do you suggest? Like what would, if somebody, like if I get my sisters, my cousin, my husband, whoever, some people like that to do it, then what next do you suggest people do?
Well, you have to identify what those communication problems are and address them. Because remember, we're trying to make impact. It's not just identifying the differences, it's impact. So now that you're armed with that information, what do you change? Oh, I just found out, I'm communicating with Lisa, really like her, but I'm a super NT type, she's NF, she's a P type, I'm a J type. How do I make sure that I'm making the allowances for that, and how is it going to affect the way that we interact? Well, when you go into storytelling mode, I need to be receptive to that. I need to ask feeling questions, and how did that change things? What changed about that narrative then? What were things like after you said that? Because for you to feel like you've gotten the point across before, because you'll get stuck, right? We all get stuck if we will find ourselves, if we're talking to someone and we don't feel like they're getting it, we will just keep saying the same thing over and over and over, especially as IN types, because we're just like, we're in a cycle until, move on to the next step, and we won't recognize that they're already there. We just bored the hell out of them. So recognizing that primary disconnect, but I think the second thing happens with listening. And, active listening skills can be really difficult for certain personality types. But I would, if I had one piece of advice when it comes to listening, take everything that you know about listening and throw it out of the window. We're not going to regurgitate points. We're not going to do any of the stuff that, the nodding and all of, no. We're going to take all that advice from the 80s and throw it out the window. Love you, Zig Ziglar, but we're going to hold on to this just for a second. Your goal in listening, whether it's your partner being angry because you stayed out for an extra 3.5 hours and didn't text, or it's your boss being misaligned on something, you need to be able to listen with a focus of being able to explain their position to them with the reasons that they think that, so that they are satisfied that you have been listening. And if you were listening with the goal of being able to give that point back to them, and in the form of a question, to make sure that they understand that you know what they're talking about and why, if you can establish that you understand how they got to the conclusion that they did, they're going to be much, much more well inclined to listen back to you and hear what you have to say, even if you disagree with them. Because most of us feel like we're being misunderstood, and that other people have other perspectives because they don't understand ours. So if you can give that other person the benefit of knowing that you see how they got there, you were able to follow their steps, and you saw how they got there, then if you have a different approach or a different step or a different outcome, they'll be willing to listen to it. And that's why remember that communication, the goal of communication isn't just to say what you need to say, it's to be understood and to provide the correct emotional and psychological framework for that understanding so that you can move forward past it. And I think people lose that at some point.
So that you can be understood and that you can understand the person that you're speaking with.
Because you also change the emotional framework. Because if they feel listened to, if they feel as if you understand their approach and why and how they got there, then they don't have anything else to say. You can say, tell me more, and they won't have anything else to say. That's good listening.
Those are great. That's really good. I love how you put that because I mean, I can really identify with that. I used to be like, I could find my attention, not during the show, but like a few years ago, I'll give you a great example. So my kids, we're on the highway driving along and they'd be like, they can tell when I'm not listening. They can tell when I've gone off into ADD land. So they'd be like, oh, look at whatever. And I'm like, oh, just driving along. Oh, and then they go.
Personality note here, INFPs are great storytellers and they love to do voices.
And then I'll never forget this. They were like, oh, there's a dead bear or something. And I'm like, oh, so, they're back there going, Mom is not listening. So after a few minutes, my son goes, oh, look at that dead tire. And I'm like, oh, and then I'm always like, wait, I did catch myself, but I've gotten a lot better as I've gotten older. And I will have to say doing the show has really helped me because you have to be able to listen, to have that conversation. You can't just be off in la la land. And also writing my last book did, because I interviewed 50 entrepreneurs for it and needed to be able to pull out, the story that I wanted to tell. So that has helped me a lot, but I can totally relate to having problems, not just listening, but really hearing.
See, and this is an example right here. Like, I'm an INTJ, you're an INFP, you're doing storytelling. For me personally, that entire story, completely unnecessary. I knew what you meant first sentence. So as an INTJ, if I'm not careful, I'll do what your partner will, roll my eyes and be like, oh, can we get past storytelling time?
Yeah.
But you're trying to say, I get what you're saying. I can see an example of why this is important. You're doing this to listen. So in an interaction where you're going into storytelling mode, if you start to see some of those common manifestations of another personality type, like I've learned to quell those responses, but if someone else hasn't, you can see that they're having a negative reaction. And then you'll start doing things like, if I gave you an example of where I saw that really apply, would that be helpful? Or just knowing that I understand, work for you? If you do a check question like that, then if you have a conversation with an INTJ, you can prevent misalignment or boredom or lack of engagement. And this is where this stuff comes from, is being able to understand the way that other people process information. Because you go into, let's say you're talking to Marlena, right? And she's an INFJ, so she would be like, what a cool story. I wonder how this story is going to position itself. How would I tell this story? Can I tell this story visually? Is there a different impact that, she's going to deconstruct, but she's going to deconstruct from the point of view of a narrative, which is also something, and that's what's interesting. That's what's neat about the personality types.
I love that. Now I'm going to become obsessed with it, though. All I'm going to want to do is go listen to all of you talking on all these podcasts and then go dive deep.
A finite amount to know. And then once you get past that finite amount to know, then the fun is applying it. So sure, deep dive into it, because after that, you're going to be deep diving into everything else that you do, and you'll get that focus off of it.
Okay. So, all right. So this weekend, I know what I'm doing. I can be really obsessive when there's something I'm interested in. Everything else can go away.
Welcome to IN. That's IN. You'd be like, oh, I'm going to pull out the magnifying glass. And
focus. Yeah.
If it helps you, my electronic business card link, I can give that to you so you have it to be able to share with your audience. That has pretty much all my big interviews and stuff on it. Talks about what I do, and it has my contact information too. So if you're interested in going down that rabbit hole, you can absolutely do that.
I have that. I have that, so I'll add it in the comments and in the show notes.
And if you're an NT type, if you get a plugin for Chrome called Video Speed Controller, you can speed up video all the way up to 5x or more and turn on subtitles, and you can literally read it like a document if you're not interested in the whole interaction. You just want to get through it super fast.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do that a lot because I'm just like, I want to listen, but I don't have time, you know?
Well, it's hard too, because depending on the size of an audience, when a person's talking about something, sometimes they have to, the slowest person in the classroom, or you lose everyone. And if you already know parts of that system, sometimes there's a inclination to fast forward through that stuff. And that's why I don't watch a lot of movies and documentaries and stuff with people that are my friends, because I want to have my hand on the skip button, and they hate that. Yeah. Or I'll deconstruct, because my way of appreciating something as an INTJ is I deconstruct stuff. INFP will write me some depressing letter that they sent to some ex to feel better about something, and I'll be like, you misspelled useless. That's the way that I am as an INTJ. So I have to be careful about that. Again, knowing the difference in personality types and stuff like that. Because for me, deconstructing an idea, pulling it apart to all of its disparate pieces, that's how I show affection. That's how I show that I'm very interested and invested in something, is actually taking the time to review it and do it. And the fact that I'm actually giving feedback on the construction, the grammatical errors, and the spelling, that means I went through and I actually processed the information and I care about what you have to say. But I do that to the wrong person.
Yeah. I can't wait to have my sister take the test, because she's like, everything you tell her, she asks you a million questions. Why'd you do that? And blah, 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 blah. So it's going to be interesting to see what hers is.
She sounds like an NT type.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, I heard you and Jason talk about something really interesting where you were talking about dopamine and about, I thought, can you bring that up or can you talk about that a little bit?
At what level would you like me to discuss it? This is an autistic creepy. There's special interest in me here, so careful. I could talk about this for an hour. Where do you want me to go?
Well, first of all, I think people will have no clue what you're even talking about. So the fact of changing those habits, you talk about whatever you want to.
Okay. All right. Here we go. All right. So dopamine, neurotransmitter, right? And I think that's an abstract concept for a lot of people. So think of it this way. It is a chemical that is made by your body. And when it goes into your brain, there are physical chemical receptors that it can bond to, right? And when that happens, it changes the way that things function. Okay? That's just all neurotransmitter means. And that changes the activity in different parts of our brain. And in the case of dopamine, it is tied inside of the reward pleasure cycle. But I think a lot of people get the misapprehension that dopamine itself is like a pleasure neurotransmitter. And what it really does at its core is it's designed to help us program behavior. And it's designed to allow us to know when we've got something good, right?
Okay.
So it's what allows us to reinforce our behavior. And if it helps, I'm sure that it's a fairly universal experience at this point, at least, in certain places. At some point in our lives, we probably have tried marijuana at some point. What marijuana does, the tetrahydrocannabinol, it actually physically mimics the same way that dopamine goes with receptors. Okay. And so it's kind of like, whereas dopamine selectively triggers different parts of our brains, when THC goes into our body, it kind of overflows, and that's trying to attach everywhere as if it's dopamine. And that's why every idea feels profound. Why do we drive on a parkway and park on a driveway? That's crazy. I'll think about that for 5 minutes. I'm going to laugh at that joke for 10 minutes. I can't seem to get rid of my hunger. I feel I'm going for water. That's because dopamine programs our behaviors but it's what gives us insight into what is a profound idea, what is a good idea, what is a bad idea. And
so even the paranoia, it's because that's overfilled.
Right, because every single thing we think could be correct, because it's got enough emotional and psychological weight as if it might be correct. And that's why different strains of THC, all of that, we can get into that. That's a whole different process, right? So dopamine at its base is basically there to help your body adapt, because you've evolved this consciousness that's able to make decisions, and there's a whole bunch of needs that we have as organisms that we need to go pursue. We need to eat, we need to drink, we need to get food, we need to reproduce, we need to, if we have a consciousness, we have to be able to decide what's a good idea, what's a bad idea. And dopamine, in conjunction with the nucleus accumbens and different parts of the brain, that's the reward center of the brain, it will help establish natural paths of behavior. Think of dopamine as Pavlov in your head ringing the bell.
Okay.
And that is what programs our behavior. Now, this becomes a problem when we start to look into the modern world. And I spoke about this with Jason, at length, but essentially there's an evolutionary process that created, the thinking, feeling brain. And all of that is based on millions of years of evolution that go towards survival. And so there is a predilection toward all kinds of different kinds of, just like in the modern world, the fact that our stomach only senses volume, it doesn't sense calories. You get a plate full of broccoli, you can eat it, you'll be completely full, and you've had 40 calories. But if you use food technology, you can have a double quarter pounder with cheese and 2 drinks and all this other stuff and put it in your stomach, and you might still want that apple pie at the end.
That's
because we have circumvented the evolutionary system, right? By inserting technology into the process. Well, what happens to the brain that's led and programmed by these dopamine responses in a world with coffee and the internet and video games and pornography and all of these different things that we enjoy because of those dopamine, and pleasure responses and all of that, and it starts to program our behavior. But interestingly, it also attenuates, it lowers our reaction to things, which is why if you spend a month drinking soda, you're not really going to be interested in that glass of water when you're thirsty.
Yeah.
And so what happens is in psychology, we have this term called anhedonia. And, we're talking about diagnostic criteria here. And it's really the idea is that we're unable to enjoy things. We don't get pleasure out of things. And it's because we've been desensitized from these really high dopamine activities. But because dopamine is involved in things that are incredibly important to human survival, like food, water, that sort of thing, there is a significant part of that process that can reset on a short timeline. And this is why I believe that a dopamine detox is something that's very beneficial. Now, I'm going to make a clarification here. There is something called a dopamine detox out there that isn't really one. So you're going to have to kind of investigate a little bit. There's a little bit of Barnum stuff going on there. There's a reason that there's a little bit of contention over this whole dopamine detox idea. The core here is that if you are constantly inundating yourself with high dopamine activities, you won't be able to get pleasure from doing the small bits of the work that you need to do to get your goals. And it will make it harder for you to have that sense of satisfaction from completing the goals that you need to get on that ladder to where you want to go. So if you find yourself not motivated, if you find yourself not enjoying the process anymore, it might be that you have desensitized yourself to the steps that you need to do and actually to enjoy your process. And that is where that whole idea of programming your own behavior comes in. If you can establish a behavior for 21 days, then it will start to take more effort to not do that behavior than it will to do it. And learning that fact about yourself, learning that you can put steps into place that seem difficult now, but 3 weeks from now won't be difficult at all, that changes your perspective on change and how you achieve your goals. And that is the short version.
So now I want you to tell the audience how they can do a dopamine detox, because I thought what you told Jason was fascinating.
Yeah, what you do is for 3 days, you don't engage in any high dopamine activities. So no sugary foods, bland food that's just for your nutritional needs, water. You get like a journal. Some people don't like the word journal for an NT type. You need to think of F types and all that. So a scientific data sheet or whatever. And anytime that you have an impulse to do something, that you want to do a high dopamine activities, you don't self-deny. You just write down on that list or the journal or the data sheet what it is that you want to do, how it is that you want to do it, and what the goals are on that thing. You map it out, and then you let go of it and you move on. And you keep on doing that for 3 days. And then after those 3 days, you resume your normal activities. And what you will find is that when you go back after those 3 days, you will have so much more enjoyment. The food will taste better. Completing the goals will feel so much better. Even something as simple as making your bed in the morning you'll get to feel an actual sense of accomplishment. I don't think a lot of people think about it, and I've given this example before, but if, as like an anthropologist, if you go into a tribal society where they barely wear clothing and you just drag that person kicking and screaming and throw them into an urban environment and put them into clothing, their whole skin will break out. They'll get rashes and all kinds of stuff. The body, the brain, it has to get used to input. And if it doesn't get used to that input, then everything has a big reaction. Then you have another challenge, and this is for people who are neurodivergent. If you have ADHD, and I'm discussing ADHD because a lot of entrepreneurs have ADHD, non-linear thinkers, don't like being told what to do, hate, normal humdrum, systems instead, like to be able to pursue their interests, impulsivity, all that stuff.
Yep.
The status of having ADHD basically means that your brain is dopamine starved. And dopamine is kind of like a bicep, in that if you have a very low level and you start to flex it, that's when it's strongest. That's when impulse is strongest. And then as you have a higher level of average dopamine, then it starts to get weaker and weaker. And so what happens, that the reason that affects ADHD the way that it does is when you first have that impulse, it's very, very strong, much stronger than it would be if you weren't dopamine starved. And that's why when you take a medication for ADHD, there's lots of different pharmacological methodologies of how to deal with that. But one of them is actually to use a stimulator like an amphetamine or something like that. And what that does is it essentially forces your body to release more dopamine so that your water level can rise. And that means that when you dive into the water, you don't crash right away because it's not shallow water. That can create a problem, though, because now you're depleting the body's natural resources and you've attenuated your responses differently. So now what happens when you get off of that medication? Then you're going to have an even more profound level of dopamine starvation. So, sometimes the cure can be worse than it really depends. Every person responds differently to medication. I'm not a clinician, nor am I a pharmacologist. So you have to talk with your doctor about that. But there are definitely different merits to going in different directions. But understanding dopamine-led programming and how it affects your behavior and how you can work with that rather than against it, not only a huge skill for entrepreneurs and people who want to be successful and professional, but also something to definitely have under your tool belt when you have ADHD. Otherwise, you won't understand why you're having the reactions. Because if you can be present in the moment and understand why you're having the impulses and things that you do, sometimes you can make different decisions as a result.
Well, I need to work on that. I'm laughing because Jason wrote ADHD right here. I'm like, I think half of us are. So give people, like, let's say people want to do their dopamine detox this weekend. So like even eating. So if they're doing, whether it's their journal or data sheet or whatever they want to call it, so like, let's say I'm sitting there and I'm like, I want to make a cobbler and eat the whole thing.
Then you write down the recipe that you want to use for the cobbler.
Okay.
You write who the people that you're going to invite. How many cobblers are you going to make?
Okay.
What's going to be different about this cobbler? Do I want to try cooking it at a different temperature? Like, spend some time brainstorming and then set it down and move on to something else. The idea is that you want to stick away from high dopamine activities, sugary foods, visual stimulation like movies, video games, picking up your phone, leave your damn phone off for those 3 days, whatever it is that you need to do, because all of that is dopamine-led programming. The reason that we're grabbing for that phone first thing in the morning, here's our source of dopamine. If we have that phone right next to us, does that remind us that we need to, maybe say good morning to our partner, ask them if they had a good night's sleep, ask them if they dreamed about anything, if they have any plans for the day? Did we grab that phone before we got a glass of water, before we stretched, before we figured out what our plan was for the day? Did we grab at that phone before we asked ourselves if there's anything new that we need to learn? I think that can be that's the problem with getting attenuated to dopamine is nothing feels, and won't rationalize any way that we need to. Because remember, the human decision-making process is emotional impulse first, and then rationalizing whether or not we can get that thing. And when we receive dopamine from that phone over and over and over again, we don't even give ourselves objections at that point. We just grab for it. It's Pavlov ringing the bell.
Yeah.
So we have to, take the round bit out of that bell for a few days and let everything calm down.
Yeah, I'm really bad about checking my phone very first thing in the morning, and my excuse is I need to clean out my email box because I can't stand all the junk that comes in
when
overnight.
You have something that gives you dopamine, your brain is a PowerPoint presenter. Well, I can't leave my phone off for 2 days. My whole life would fall apart. Really? What would happen?
And I start going.
And you said, if there's an important message, you're going to get it to me. Yeah. Otherwise, I'm going to be without it. Well, now important messages can get through. So what's your next excuse?
Yeah.
And your brain's going to keep on coming up with them because it doesn't want to put that phone down.
That's right. Well, what you said about about what to write down and using the recipe as a simple example, it's almost like the inverse of people who worry. I was telling my sister the other day, when you're worrying about something that you have no clue is even going to happen, if you worry about it enough, it's like it's happening. You're living that experience and you get all the same negative feelings, and it may never happen, but it kind of physiologically has. So this is almost the inverse of that kind of.
And then when we talk about dopamine-led programming, the other thing to think about is that same evolutionary system predisposes us to think about negative experiences. They're recorded with anywhere from, psychologists disagree, anywhere from 5 to 25 times the primacy of positive experiences. And that's evolutionarily favored. Lion chases up a tree. We need to remember that, right?
Yeah.
And that's why, 15 years later, nobody stays awake at 4 a.m. with one eye open thinking about that job interview that went really well 15 years ago.
Yeah.
We reprocess our negative experiences because that's something that's predisposed evolutionarily for survival. But think about how that affects our narrative, our beliefs, whether or not we get imposter syndrome. We forget all of our positive experiences and remember all of our negative ones. How is that going to change you as a person? And what are you doing to counteract it? And I think a lot of people don't have an answer for that question, and it's important to have one.
Well, I'm doing my dopamine detox this weekend.
You should. It's pretty amazing. And when you come out of it and you actually do something, that's on your list that you were thinking about, and you get to enjoy it like 5 times as much because you did that process, you will thank yourself for it. And the next time you do something, that paper that you've been putting off, or that thing that you didn't want to do, and then you actually get to feel that sense of accomplishment and positivity as a result of it, that will have an impact on you too.
Yeah, I think it'll really help me because I've got some things that I even want to do, and I keep putting them off. It's just, it's like my
Thank you, Marlena, in the comments, and Jason, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to put it up there a second. I'll be like, I want to do it, but my brain is going, no, don't do it. So I'm hoping this will feel like that. Yeah. Oh yeah. Marlena says, I talk to Anshar often. I'm always fascinated and learn so much. Every single interaction. It's exhausting to this INFJ brain. LOL. Seriously, God, I can't even read tonight. Seriously though. Appreciate you, my friend. And we appreciate you, Marlena. Thanks for joining us.
And my INTJ brain is like, you used the wrong number of periods in the first 2 ellipses, and an ellipsis is supposed to have a space in front of and behind it. And then the little voice in the back of my head is, you just socially reciprocate. Tell her how nice it is for her to say that, because she needs to know that's what you mean by pulling apart that statement. That's so what about communication is so important.
Yeah. All right, everybody out there, first, I want you to go watch the episodes that Anshar did with Jason. They're awesome. I want you to check out Marlena's website in marlenasemenza.com, I believe. She's a great friend of ours, so you'll get some. And Anshar's been on her show as well, on her podcast.
Yeah, we had a great conversation about the personality type and branding, how that affects your branding, how you put that narrative forward.
And I want you to go take your personality type and do the things that he said about getting the people close to you to do theirs so that you can start practicing.
So cheat code for that, if you go to Google and you just type J types 2. So JTYPES and the number 2, no spaces. Okay. The very first link that comes up will be human metrics. They have like a 70 question test. I highly, highly recommend, making sure mentally you're focusing on your nature, not what you have learned to do. Because if you take a paid Myers-Briggs test, it'll be like 400 questions, and they're just trying to combat that whole small sample size thing. So you have to be very honest about your nature versus what you have learned to do. But if you do that, then you'll get a 4-letter type. And then what I recommend is, I'm not really a big fan of human metrics' results page because it's very basic. Once you get that 4-letter type, go over to 16personalities.com. It's 16personalities.com. And then you can plug your type in there, and it'll give you a lot more in depth. And then if you want to, you can even take their advanced version of the test to get even more specific. And then they have a paid results thing if you want to go past that. But they have a lot that's there at a basic level.
Okay. And do your dopamine detox whenever you want.
It'll change your world. It really, really will.
Yeah. I'm excited about doing that. I think I've never heard anybody talk about that, Anshar.
Well, I used to never be able to wake up on time. I would never make my bed. I would always put off, washing my clothes until I was literally smelling them to see which ones I should wear. And when you have ASD, sometimes you can completely forget about stuff like hygiene and stuff. Think about it. For a while in high school, and now I think back to it, and it bothers me. My hair was all greasy, and I would just put it back every single because it didn't matter to me.
Right.
And when you have ASD, you don't really think about what matters to everyone else. There's almost kind of a Nietzschean assumption that everyone's like you almost, which doesn't even make sense, but it's there. So I had to learn a lot from that process. But yeah, that's the easy level there for personality typing. And then, I've talked on the subject at great length in quite a different way. And then, believe it or not, there are manifestations of body language that are reflected in personality type. There are different ways that you should close and present information based off of personality type. There are different things that you should do in a negotiation based on the personality type of the person that you look at. There is a way to be able to tell a person's personality type by looking at their LinkedIn profile, believe it or not. There's all kinds of different systems. And yes, I could tell by looking at a LinkedIn profile whether or not the person who is on the profile is the person who wrote the profile.
Yes.
100%. Because you compare the language and the idiomatic expression and all of that that's on the profile page with when that person's actually commenting and saying stuff, on other people's content, when they're speaking in the first person versus not. And if you see a difference, well, then that means you can't use that profile for that.
Yeah. Great points. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Anshar. I've had a blast. I need to have you back on sometime to go deeper into some of this stuff.
Ask me any follow-up questions if you get people who watch and they're curious about a topic, or if they want, they want the lower level to medium explanation of something that's on a higher level. People don't understand, neuromarketing, or why is cognitive neuroscience important in business, or why do the colors that I use in my web page matter, or what's the deal with using human faces in my web page, and why do I want to do that? And if I do that, what should that look like? There's all kinds of things. There's a whole bunch of considerations for all of this stuff. And in the course of doing public relations, I've done all kinds of really, really cool stuff just from understanding, because public relations really is a psychological discipline. I don't know if you know this or not, but the father of public relations is actually Edward Bernays, and he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And his process came from asking himself, well, how do I use that in business? And, of course, a lot of Freud's theories and stuff have been, remodeled or disproven or whatever since then as psychology has continued to grow. But that approach has stayed. At one point in his market, people weren't, it was very negatively perceived for women to smoke. And he basically went to women's rights marches and gave the women cigarettes to smoke and paid them to smoke them and called them torches of freedom. And then he went into the movie industry, and every time that you saw a powerful woman or powerful woman, they give them a cigarette, and it completely changed the cultural narrative, and it created a demand for the product. And this is why understanding the different psychological dynamics that go into the behaviors. We went from we had a very, very big psychological change in the way that we look at everything from political candidates to to buying consumer products in the last 150 years. Understanding the history of that, understanding how we went from having a debate on a stage where people are attacking each other's ideas versus like, I don't know if you remember Eisenhower's campaign. It was a cartoon of a bunch of kids strutting around going, we like Ike, we like Ike.
Yeah.
Bit of a difference there, right?
Yeah.
In our culture and how we look at things. We used to have a culture where we didn't buy things that we didn't need. And now we have a culture where we'll spend extra on something just because it has a particular name associated with it. So understanding that journey and how the brain is leveraged in that journey, it helps you keep yourself from making mistakes like the one that Coca-Cola made when it did New Coke. Because they assumed as drink makers, like as engineers, if I make a drink that tastes better, we're going to sell more of it. But is that why people are buying Coke? Or is it the nostalgia? Is that first can of Coke that they opened with their grandfather? Is changing the brand going to damage the brand because of nostalgia? And these are the questions that people can't ask without doing proper market research.
And it's really interesting now too to see all these, especially banks, changing their company names and everything because they think that's what Gen Z wants to see. And maybe it is, but it's just they're all like in line following each other. It's going to be interesting to see long term.
If you want like some homework, something interesting, there are two things that might change the way that you look at Gen Z in today's market. Okay. And the first is the mouse universe experiment. You'll have to read up on that. See if you can take a look at the mouse universe and see how that might apply to Gen Z, right? Okay. That might be fun, right? Talking about how to apply, some science and enjoy some stuff. And then another would be to read up on schizotypal personality disorder. People who have schizotypal personality disorder, they need to feel as if they're being treated differently and separately from the rest of society. They only want to associate and include themselves with people that can be different and disparate from society. They solve problems with magical thinking. They have distorted, moral or social views, and then you get things like Dunning-Kruger syndrome, where people don't know what they don't know. And so because of the way that their self-esteem dynamic works, they will feel that they're an expert on something or know something when they don't know it at all.
I've known a lot of people like that.
So this is where the interesting stuff in psychology is. So the Calhoun's mouse experiments, schizotypal personality disorder, and then you can dive into the last one too if you're interested.
Okay, y'all. There's
my fascination from. This is where my brain is like, oh, my INTJ brain is like, I love that.
Well, and now all I want to do is go read this stuff and dive deep into it. I'll do that.
Short version of the Calhoun experiment is he basically said, if I take a whole bunch of mice and I put them into an enclosed space and I give them unlimited access to survival resources, what is going to happen to that population when it gets to saturation, and what will change? And that's the answer that you can look into that. And then the rest of it, Dunning-Kruger is really interesting just because you're going to read it and you're going to be like, oh God, I know a lot of people like that. I hope I'm not like that. And then you start to self-evaluate and you start to figure out some really cool stuff about that too.
Interesting. And also, y'all, I will be putting Anshar's link, his business card link, into the comments and into the show notes because he's got a ton of good content, shows he's been on, white papers, all kinds of stuff, right?
Yeah. I've used applied behavioral psychology and cognitive neuroscience to get people on Nightline, to help people who are on Forbes 100 list. I've had one client who came out of nowhere and has like 4 or 5 documentaries done on them now.
Wow.
You can use these skills for PR. You can do them to design sales processes. I've completely redesigned all of the at many of the high name like legal establishments here in Nevada. I completely changed their psychological sales process and what they hand out to new employees and stuff. And that's because approaching things differently, finding the part of what you do and how you do it differently, this is how you build your own brand. And for me, my brand is about my clients' results. And that's why when I do calls and stuff, I give them the first call for free because I want them to come to that call with at least my normal charge in things that they want to get. And that way they already leave from the first call with value, and I know that they're going to come back because they're going to be so happy with that experience and those solutions. And at that point, they're just going to be paying me with money that I already helped them earn.
I want you to come back on and let's talk about PR because so many entrepreneurs and small business owners do have such big problems with that. So let's do
I
that.
have a list of 100 topics I could speak on. What you do is just ask your audience what they would like to know most about, get them to do some real world applications or questions or whatever. Maybe we can get some examples. Everyone learns differently. Sometimes talking about ideas is too abstract. So if you want to know what it looks or sounds like so that we get down to the concrete, I'm happy to do that too. I made the same offer to Jason too. If anyone goes and is willing to suffer through, 2.5 hours of interview and then actually has some questions of substance from that, I'm happy to do a follow-up episode. My time is your time.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I've really enjoyed it.
I really enjoyed it too, and I look forward to seeing you at another one of the events.
Thanks, and see y'all next week.